So like I said, we do make that transition over to college basketball now with professional handicapper John Ryan at John Ryan Sports and the number one regular contributor to BangTheBook.com. John, how's it going today, man?
I'm doing really well, Adam. How about yourself?
Doing very well, buddy. Appreciate your time as always here. We are going to take deep dives into the Big Ten and the Big East conference tournaments here. But before we get into that specifically, John, bunch of conference tournaments wrapping up here on Tuesday night. Some of them have already wrapped up, and a lot of other conference tournaments starting up here. So just as a general rule, looking at conference tournaments as a whole, what are some betting tips that you have for listeners out there? You know, maybe how you handicap it differently than the regular season, or just stuff you're kind of looking for?
Well, the first thing that always comes to mind is the fact that these games are mostly played on neutral courts. So the players' sight lines are different. For example, teams that are playing at Madison Square Garden or the arena in Indianapolis, it's going to be harder to make shots. Teams that rely on the three-point shot especially are going to be affected by the neutral court setting. And some of these neutral court settings are in venues that possibly the whole conference has not played in, and they're just simply using an NBA arena. So what that means is that you want to look for the unders. And one that I like here off the top of my head that I'll probably never forget for the remainder of my life, because it is a moneymaker. You want to get teams that are in a tournament. In other words, there's no rest between games. So they're playing at least their second of back-to-back nights against an opponent in the same position. And the under has done 65% since 2005. So it's very simple that if both teams have no rest, and the total has to be under 140. I'm sorry, I didn't mention that critical part. So if you're under 140 in the total and both teams are playing back-to-back nights, the under is in play automatically no matter who they are. And that's a blind system that has not lost. It's tied one time in those 15 years for the season record. All the other years it was profitable.
Well, that's important too, because again, you get a lot of these back-to-back situations that these teams aren't used to. I mean, the breaking news we mentioned in the top of today's show that everyone probably knows by now, the Ivy League Conference tournament has been canceled. Yale is the winner because they won the regular season. They'll go to the NCAA tournament, but that's a conference used to playing back-to-back days. Some of these teams played back-to-back in the early season, showcase tournaments in November or whatever, but they don't do that after that point. So the fatigue factor is a big deal. You just don't have that same kind of life. And also, too, it's win or go home. So maybe you want to tap into that depth a little bit, but maybe you can't. Maybe you don't have that opportunity. You want to ride your best 5, 6, 7 guys, something like that. They wind up with those big workloads, and those back-to-back spots can definitely be very challenging.
That's another great point. That's another thing that I look at game by game or round by round is the percentage of minutes played by the starters versus the roster. And if that number is, in other words, if the starters are playing more and more minutes than they did during the season average, that's going to increase the fatigue factor. Shots are going to come up short. They're going to hit the front of the rim, and they're not going to hit shots like they did during the regular season. A little bit further along there, if you have a team in that same situation where the starters, and then sometimes I include the sixth man too, are playing the majority of the minutes at a level much higher than the season average and are coming off a game where they shot 50% from threes. The under, I forget what it is, but it's very, very high. The under is one in the high 70s over 15 years. Now, granted, it doesn't come up very often, but when it does, being aware of it obviously is a good thing to know.
Yeah, this is definitely the time of the year where you do end up getting a lot of regression to the mean on a game-by-game level, and in particular because that fatigue kind of plays a bit of a role here. And look, we could end up with a lot of fatigue in this Big Ten Conference tournament. The bottom 4 seeds start on Wednesday night, 6 o'clock Eastern, the first game, Northwestern and Minnesota, Nebraska, Indiana after that. The other top 10 seeds kind of start things off a little bit slowly. You've got the 5 through 10, on Thursday. The top 4 seeds get that double bye into the quarterfinals on Friday. But Wisconsin winds up being the number 1 seed here in the Big Ten. But in a lot of places, they're a 3rd or 4th favorite here in the 6.5 to 1 range. Michigan State, the 2 seed, they're the favorite, pretty much market wide in that plus 250, plus 275 range. Maryland, the 3 seed, all those teams tied at 14-6, but Maryland draws the 3 seed because of tiebreakers. They're about 4 to 1 out there. You've got Michigan priced very low as a team that's made some runs here over the last few years in this conference tournament, despite being a 9 seed. You got Illinois and Iowa, the 4-5. Some people say those are kind of weak 4 and 5 teams. Penn State, Ohio State, Rutgers. The thing about this conference, John, is that we've seen the ceiling for everybody, and we've seen the floor for pretty much everybody. Now we have to figure out which teams can be the most consistent.
Yeah, that's it's very true. This is a conference where only 4 of the teams in the whole conference weren't at some point during the regular season ranked in the top 25. And I can't remember any conference ever achieving that kind of success. Now, whether the tournament will tell us when we get there how good these teams are, and whether some of the teams that were ranked, maybe the Penn States of the world, where they lose the first game perhaps, and then, of course, the media will say that, well, the Big Ten was overrated. I think everybody who's ever listened to this podcast knows that I firmly believe that this is by far the best and deepest conference for the season and in the nation, and probably one of the best I've seen in the last 10 years. The quality of play is just awesome. They all take care of the ball, even the teams like Nebraska and Northwestern. I like to look at assist to turnover ratio. And by the way, on my rankings, Michigan State is the top team. So I think they're lined properly with the futures as the favorite. But they're not a favorite by much, as you pointed out. But their assist to turnover ratio is 1.48, which this means that they average 1.5 assists against 1 turnover per game, which is very, very high and ranks very high in the nation. Most college teams are in the 1.1. Anything over 1 at the college level is pretty good. You're getting more assists than committing turnovers. But the whole conference here is above 1. Iowa 1.47, which that's not surprising because they're an offensive juggernaut. And if they could ever learn to play defense consistently, they could easily be a Final Four team. Michigan's 1.4. Minnesota, there's one that's flying under the radar. If they could find a way to win games instead of, I don't know how many games they've blown double-digit leads, but it's kind of a shame for them and their fans. But that Minnesota could be a sleeper in this thing if they get it together. Their ratio is 1.4. Northwestern, who is a very bad record team, they actually would probably be a contender in most of the other conferences. They're 1.34, Penn State 1.33, Wisconsin 126. I think you get the point. A team like Purdue, I actually put this out on Twitter. I saw them on one of the sites at 40 to 1. I think on the site I'm looking at now, they're much lower than that. They're like, this says 24 to 1 to win the tournament, the conference tournament. So I couldn't talk somebody out of not making that bet because there is a ton of value in that. They were ranked 23rd in week 1 and obviously didn't have their act together until basically the last month. Now, if that trend is going to continue in the tournament, they could be the Cinderella team. And I don't mind paying 24 to 1 to have a part of that risk. But the ones I think that can win, I like Penn State and Ohio State at 8 to 1 or thereabouts. And it is the time to really shop for the lines because it just kind of hit me that the lines here can be all over the place on the web. and whether you actually can get that price and place the bet is, that remains to be seen. But shopping for the lines, I think, is a really good thing. And I was just thinking, Adam, you like the rollover too, I think, in these tournaments. Is that right?
Yeah, the money line rollover as a general rule is probably going to wind up being much better than the futures price. The thing that's really difficult, though, about a conference like this, and I remember this, I think I wrote about, I want to say it was maybe Minnesota against Maryland or somebody like that here in this conference, where I think it was a late February game, and Minnesota's like a 500 or below 500 level team in conference play, and they're taking out one of the top 3 teams in this conference. And the line's like, Maryland pick 'em or something like that.
Yep.
It's like the differences between these teams, even though you've got some that have good records and some that have bad records, are very, very small within the way that they're ranked. It's just some teams have won the close games and some teams haven't. Some teams are maybe a little bit more consistent than others, but you're running into situations here where, you may get a game that's something like, a 10 versus 2, or, well, maybe not with Michigan State, but you may get a game that's, Rutgers in Wisconsin or Michigan and Wisconsin. That's an 8 or 9 versus 1 game. That line's not going to be that big. In other conferences, you see an 8 or 9 versus a 1, and it's 7, 8, 10, 12 points, whatever the case may be. It's probably 2.5 or 3 in a conference like this. So the futures prices are reflective of that in the market, in the sense that you've got a bunch of teams here that are 10 to 1 or lower, just because these teams are generally rated pretty close together.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm just looking at the metrics I use to calculate the anticipated odds for a game. And Michigan State is number 1, like I said. But Michigan State, with the exception of Northwestern and Nebraska, they would be favored by no more than 6 points on a neutral court. So if they would end up playing in Minnesota, I would line them at 6.5. Of course, the public's going to be all over Michigan State, so you would expect the lines maker maybe to make it 8. But to your point, there would be no double-digit favorites for the whole tournament. I would be shocked if there is a double-digit favorite in the tournament.
Yeah, I mean, outside of, maybe if Northwestern or Nebraska advances, something like that, but certainly looks like they're going to have an uphill climb with Minnesota and Indiana in those first round games there on Wednesday. So, John, what do we do here? I mean, we know that these lines are going to be tight. We know that these games are going to come down to, probably the last few possessions, or, maybe the free throw line, something like that. What do we do here? I mean, who do you kind of like in this tournament? And, are there any, maybe matchup specific games as we look down the line where you're going to look to make some ATS plays?
Well, free throw percentage now becomes a big factor, even bigger than the regular season, of course. So Michigan State is on top in the conference in free throw percentage at roughly 75%. Now, again, we have the consistency here. By tenths of a percent less, Maryland, Wisconsin, Ohio State, and Iowa are all basically shooting the same free throw percentage. So then you have to go and dig into the players that are going to be getting the ball and the ones that shoot 88%. And that obviously gives a little bit of a lean towards the Michigan States. Michigan State and Penn State free throw percentage late in the game are the tops. So, a team like Nebraska is shooting 61% from the free throw line. I don't expect them to win, even though they did beat. They didn't beat. I confused that with Northwestern being Penn State last week. So scratch that. I think Nebraska's lost 16 or 17 in a row. So Nebraska is not going to advance. That would be a shocker. So the other game is Indiana and Northwestern. And Indiana is not a bad free throw shooting team at 68%. But they're going to be good enough to get through and into the next round. I think they then play Iowa. So that's the mystery of the whole tournament is Iowa. I always come in my brain, I'm trying to figure this out and have like a perfect bracket just for a conference would be nice. And Iowa's the real wild card because of that defense. Um, you know, we know they can score a ton of points. They can score 100 on any given night, pretty much against anybody. So that Iowa is a team I think I would back because I don't want to call them a loose cannon, Adam, but they're like a gun. They're the gunslinger. That's the word I'm looking for. They're the gunslinger in the Big Ten. Let's see.
And that's the thing too is, you try in a conference tournament like this, I think, to find a ceiling, because that you've got certain baselines for these teams, but which team has the chance of playing, highest above its baseline? And for Iowa, if they play really well offensively, how bad is that defense? Or I guess the better question is, how well does the opposition shoot against them? I think for Michigan State, we know that defensively they're very, very good. They're tops in 2-point percentage defense, tops in 3-point percentage defense. Their biggest problem all year long has been they don't force turnovers. They don't get extra possessions. So to me, I think a team like Michigan State, while we know they're very good defensively and we know they're pretty solid offensively, if they don't shoot well and they get fewer chances because they don't force turnovers, then what happens to them? I think Michigan State almost has, as crazy as this sounds, a higher risk of ruin than some of the other teams that are out there, just because other teams may generate extra possessions or may have a higher offensive ceiling or something like that. So that's kind of what led me towards Iowa in this conference tournament, is that I know they're terrible defensively. I am fully aware of that. But they could shoot the lights out. And if they shoot the lights out 4 days in a row, they can win this thing. But I think that they just have kind of that higher upside when you look at this field as a whole. And then you get a question with a team like Wisconsin, for example, to where, they play teams in Iowa and Illinois that maybe have some level of upside, but also maybe have a lower floor, to where Illinois struggles to score. Iowa struggles to play defense. Wisconsin, by drawing the number 1 seed, may actually have the best path to the championship game because they don't play Ohio State. They don't play Penn State. They don't play Michigan State. They don't play Maryland. So that's kind of the way that you sort of want to narrow this thing down on a round by round, go from a macro to a micro level type of thing here. That's just sort of the way that I kind of approach this one because, again, like we've already established, 9 of these teams could win this thing, maybe 10 if you like Purdue, and not a single one of them would shock me.
Yeah, I agree with that. The shocking factor is pretty minimal here because you'd go, yeah, well, I can see that. But along the lines of what you're talking about, Wisconsin comes into this thing, the number 1 seed, and they've won 8 in a row. So in terms of a ceiling, this is the question. Are they at the ceiling now? Did they actually go past their ceiling and now they're going to, crash and burn in the first game? You would think not because they're so disciplined with the ball. And to your point, they don't look to force turnovers. They look to rebound the basketball and then minimize the opponent's second chance scoring opportunities. Which in many ways I've done some tests on that. And when you minimize offensive rebounds of an opponent, that's basically like a turnover. You're limiting the number of possessions they have, and in so doing, and it's not rocket science, the less possessions you have, the fewer points that you're probably going to score. So it's hard to think that Wisconsin is due for a fallback. What they are due for, though, and it just hit my brain here, is teams that have the longest rest, the double bye, for example, in the Big Ten, and you get a team playing on back-to-back nights. That team on back-to-back nights, especially if it's the underdog, and it will be in this conference, the team that hasn't played can start out pretty slow, believe it or not. Even though they're the number 1 seed or number 2, 3, or 4, the fact that they haven't played in 5 days, it sometimes works against them. So that will be something to look at, too, when Wisconsin finds out who their opponent's going to be. Penn State is on a 3-game losing streak, so I'm still on the wagon, Adam, but I'm needing some Knob Creek to keep me on it. They look really tired in the last, especially the last game. Senior night didn't go well either. I think the rest for them is huge. They're going to play the winner of the Nebraska game, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you would think that they would advance, and then where the heck's my bracket?
Well, I guess the last thing I'll ask you about here, and then we'll transition over to the Big East just to make sure we get to spend a good amount of time on that. Again, these are such unique scenarios because everything is neutral site for the most part, at least in these, big conference tournaments, everything's neutral site. And you've got the back-to-back factors. So how much of this is about reliance on your machine learning tools, and how much of this is maybe on some of the less quantifiable factors, like what you're seeing with your eyes or what you kind of, believe to be true about this type of format?
Well, they call it March Madness for a reason. The machine learning tools have learned from the decades of data. But I found that the machine learning value of it becomes diminished. It's not as accurate. It's not as when I say accurate, not in terms of maybe against the spread, but there could be a game where, let's use an example, Penn State is playing Indiana, and Penn State's is projected to score 75 points and have the better assist-to-turnover ratio. So you plug that into the database and you find out how they've done as a precedent for those two parameters. And let's say that during the regular season, it hits 85%. And games where they achieved those performance measures, that was the result. But in the tournaments, it's less. So it could be still on the winning side of above 50%, certainly, but it might be 65. And there's more times where I could be dramatically wrong. And that's part of the madness. So you can have a situation where Penn State was supposed to do that, but then they score 55 points and turn the ball over 22 times. And those are the things that, I'm not aware of any tool out there or coding process that can anticipate when a team is really going to light it up or when they're really going to, crap the bed. But that's the wonderful thing about the tournament. What I try to focus on is the ones that are more methodical. Like we mentioned, the under system, which applies, and there's another one that I can read off here as well. This one is 82% over the last 15 seasons, and this one has not had a losing season. And if you don't write this down, you can always direct message me on Twitter, and I'll feed it back to you. But the system goes to play under neutral court teams with the totals between 130 and 140, and it's a below average shooting team, not a horrible team, but they're at least making 42% of their shots on the season. And they're coming off a game where they made 50% or more of their three-pointers. That's 23-5 under 82%. If you want more action, more games, in other words, to bet on, a total of 140, neutral site, teams hitting 42%, and shot 50% from the field in their last game. That's 40-19 over the last 15 years. So it's ones like that I like playing, and of course I have dozens of others that are on the sides because I'm more of a side player than a total. But I think we both agree that for whatever reason, I don't mind being like if the public is all over and under, and that system I just read is on the under, and the machine learning is on the under, I'm taking the under. That sentiment that we've talked about for several shows, where the percentage of bets is above 75% is a red flag. Well, in the tournament, it's still a red flag to me, but it's not one that disqualifies the opportunity. So it's maybe I'm fighting myself by making the bet because I all of a sudden changed the rules from the regular season to the postseason. But I think it's making the point of what is different.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, that's what we've kind of always talked about here on this show is that, you've really got 3 college basketball seasons within a season. You've got non-conference, conference play, and the postseason. And the postseason is just an altogether different animal, not just with what's at stake, but also, again, with the rest factors that do come into play here. And with that, we talk Big East Conference tournament here, Madison Square Garden for this one. 10 teams on hand. Creighton, Villanova, Seton Hall, all tying atop the conference at 13-5. But Creighton winds up the number 1, Villanova the 2, Seton Hall the 3. And if you look out there, some places do have Seton Hall the favorite, despite how they wrapped up the regular season. They're plus 250 at BetOnline. They're a little bit higher than that, I think plus 340 over at 5 Dimes, where all 3 teams, Creighton, Villanova, and Seton Hall, plus 340. Then you've got teams like Butler that are very capable. Providence, it's been maybe the best team in this conference over the last 3 or 4 weeks. You've got Marquette, who's a very good team. Xavier's made some runs, but by and large with Chris Mack at the helm for those. So what are you kind of looking at here from the Big East, John, as far as, sort of a general perspective on the way that this conference is seeded and the way that these teams come in?
Well, I think the biggest news on my tablet these days is on Creighton, and their guard Marcus Zagorowski is doubtful for at least the first game of the Big East tournament and perhaps the whole tournament. He was injured in the last game. I guess it was his right kneecap injury that is maybe going to eliminate him for the whole tournament. And he's a pretty big part of that offense. That when that offense is running well, like we saw against Seton Hall this last game, there's no stopping them. And I've been hearing that there's been significant bets by respected professionals out in Vegas that are backing Creighton to win the whole thing. Not just the Big East, but the NCAA. Now, the good news is on their roster, there's a guy that played Denzel Mahoney, subbed for him in a game earlier this season. And he's been pretty much their sixth man coming off the bench. And he's averaging 12 points a game, 24 minutes. And he scored 16 points in last week's game, in which that was a game that Zagorowski played almost the whole game until he got hurt late in the fourth quarter. So I'm not too concerned about that offense still remaining well, because the guy who's coming in for Zagorowski is pretty darn good in his own right, and he's not a freshman. And that brings up another thing with freshmen in both these conferences and in the NCAA tournament is, they're going to these conference tournaments for the first time, and it might be the first time to that venue. And again, the sight lines are huge. And I, have friends that have played basketball, and back in, when I was younger, it's true. You get into a different gym and all of a sudden you can't hit the side of a barn door until you get accustomed to the surroundings. And then all of a sudden you're warming up in the game, and now all of a sudden there's people moving around in the background. And that's pretty difficult to overcome in some cases. And then, again, that supports that whole thing with the under. But I still like Creighton a lot to win this conference tournament. And I have a liking on Villanova as well. Now, the Villanova situation is a wild card because they're very young. But their freshmen, Robinson, Earl, and Moore, have really, really stepped up their game, and they've contributed a lot to where Villanova is at a point now where they could win the tournament and much more. Those two players are playing at a very high level, and you would never know they're freshmen. They look pretty seasoned. But again, that's a reflection of how the Big Ten and the Big East are, in my opinion. That they're all these teams are battle tested when they go to the NCAA tournament, and if they're playing against a team that is not, Gonzaga always comes to my mind. Very, very good team, no doubt about it. But they don't play anybody, and they barely beat San Francisco last night. They probably should have lost, actually, but you understand my point. There's no team like that in this conference that doesn't have a lot of scars on them. So Creighton, I'm seeing them at 4-1. They're actually listed third at this particular book. And of course, DePaul, St. John's, Georgetown are long shots at 33, 45, and 55 to 1. But St. John's is a team basically playing at their home court, which I'm sure you're aware of, Adam. And I think, who do they take on in the first game? I think it's Providence, isn't it? No, it's Creighton.
St. John's plays Georgetown. And then if they beat Georgetown, they'd wind up playing Creighton. And quite frankly,
yep,
that's a scary game to me for Creighton. And you wouldn't think that it would be, but you look at this St. John's team, and I imagine this is kind of where you were going with St. John's. Highest turnover percentage on defense in the conference, lowest turnover percentage on offense in the conference. So they don't make a lot of shots. They don't shoot it very well, but they take care of the basketball and they get their extra possessions. And what worries me about Creighton here in a venue like Madison Square Garden, which is tuned towards the under in college basketball, and in fact, it's a pretty solid under at that. It's one of those spots to me where if Creighton doesn't shoot well, and if they don't have Zagorowski, who was their highest assist man during the regular season, kind of the facilitator of the offense and a 42% three-point shooter, St. John's could beat them. And what makes that so interesting is that if Creighton has to spend a lot of energy against St. John's and they do win that game, I don't think Providence or Butler is a walkthrough in the semifinals for them. So Creighton worries me a little bit here in this conference. I understand why you like them, and I understand why a lot of smart people like them too, because they shoot threes. They shoot a lot of threes, and they get a lot of high percentage looks from two. That's kind of the direction of analytics in college basketball now. So they fit that mold. They fit that criteria. But I also think in a situation like this, St. John's could beat them. If St. John's doesn't, they may be tenderized enough for a Providence or a Butler to take them down in the semis.
Yeah, I definitely see that. That's the that sums it up with Creighton. But I think if Creighton gets through, they're probably going to meet up against Villanova or Seton Hall. But again, the Seton Hall is playing the 6th seed Marquette, and that's not an automatic win into the semis by any stretch of the imagination. And they've had their cage rattled here pretty good coming down the stretch. So confidence level can't be anywhere where it once was for the Pirates. But Ed, you're right. That St. John's game, I bet you Creighton would rather play Georgetown.
And again, I mean, maybe it doesn't, hijack a Creighton future, but I can just tell you, I'll probably be on St. John's against the spread there in that early game on Thursday. Like you said, I mean, St. John's plays in this venue, very accustomed to it. Creighton playing that early start time will be a pro St. John's crowd for, however sparsely attended that game winds up being. And again, that's also something you want to take a look at here in these conference tournaments. We've kind of talked about them from a future standpoint here, but in terms of narrowing this stuff down a little bit more, game by game on more of a micro level here, let's say Xavier ends up beating DePaul, as they probably should. I don't think Xavier matches up particularly well with Villanova. What worries me for Villanova is if they play 3 games in 3 days, they have virtually no bench to rely on. They use their starting 5 very, very heavily. That's not really the way it's been for Jay Wright's teams of late. But again, they get that shot against Xavier where I think it's a very favorable matchup for them. Seton Hall with Marquette, kind of Miles Powell versus Marcus Howard there. As you start looking at a game-by-game level, it does open up a lot of opportunities here as well.
Yeah, it's a good point. The players on the court are pretty young, so I don't think there's any issue with fatigue going back-to-back. But I think when you go 3 in a row and you're used to playing 2 games a week with 2 or 3 days rest in between each one, I think that's a big shock to the body no matter what your age is. So that's a very good point.
So I know you said that you like Creighton here. With the machine learning tools, I mean, how do you sort of rank the other teams here in this conference?
Well, let's pull up that page. In this conference, I do have Creighton if Creighton faced Villanova in the final, which is Villanova's number 2 team, Creighton would be favored by 3. If, believe it or not, Butler is number 3. So
really?
There's yep.
Is it a defense thing?
Yeah, on them it is. This is an overall rating. So Offensively, the defensive rating is not quite as good as some of the others in the conference, but it's at the top. And like we had talked about with the Big Ten, with the exception of DePaul, all these teams have the potential to win a game against each other on any given night. Creighton's offense is by far the best offense, and they're they're prone to the surroundings too. They shoot a ton of threes. Not the highest in the conference, but they do rely on that open jump shot. Let's get back to the one. They average, in terms of assists to field goals made, which is one that I like, they're second at 0.57. Providence is top in the conference. So talk about ball movement and why Providence has been playing so well of late. It's usually ball movement. For some reason, Adam, it's a lot easier to hit a shot without a hand in your face than when it is not in your face. It's one of my coaching points. So the assist to turnover ratio, Creighton is 1.5. Again, that's up there in the leagues of the Michigan States. Villanova's second, 1.4. St. John's, 1.37. And then it drops down to 1.19 for Butler, Seton Hall 1.15. And although that's good, Adam, for Seton Hall to be at 1.15, it's really not what I'd like to see for a conference champion or a Final Four team. At 1.33 and above, and that's one of the criteria to make a Final Four, come to think of it. So, Marquette is not a good ball handling team, and we were talking about a possible upset with them over Seton Hall. And Xavier is tied with Marquette, second to last in the conference in ATR. So, machine learning, again, it's like the example with the example I did in the Big Ten. So Creighton is always going to have projections of 78 or more points. And I can tell you off the top of my head, because I've run them so many times, that when Creighton scores 81 or holds their opponent under 65, the winning percentage is very, very high. So you would look for a matchup of, Creighton playing, it would have to be a pretty good upset here. Just say hypothetically, Creighton ends up playing at Butler, where they could reasonably expect to hold them to under 65 points. Then that's starting to set up the betting opportunity. The flip side of this is with Creighton scoring so many points per game and leading the conference by a pretty wide margin, especially in conference games. They're scoring 78.3 against the teams in the tournament. Second is Villanova at 73. I'm sorry, St. John's is actually second at 74, and then Villanova. So with that kind of edge, they're going to have to also shoot. They can have an off night and still win the game. But if they're on, I don't see anybody in the tournament that can keep pace with them. And at that point, the defensive part of it doesn't really matter. So I think looking ahead, the machine learning stuff is going to look for those gaps between the offensive metrics and the defensive metrics, meaning the differentials. So if a team is posting a differential of, say, 6.83 points like Creighton is, and all of a sudden the projections come out that Creighton's going to win the game by 12. That's 6 points over the average conference scoring differential. And if the line is, I'm just throwing this out there, if the line is 6, we have a value right there of 6 points because the projections are saying that they're going to win by 12. So I hope that made sense what I was trying to get through there.
Yeah, it definitely does. And again, it's very important to find all of the different means of breaking down these conference tournaments. And John helps us out with that over at BangTheBook.com. You got to look at the Big Ten conference tournament, look at the Big East conference tournament coming up here today. And of course, as always, you can follow John on Twitter at John Ryan Sports and the number 1. John, what are people going to get from you if they follow you on Twitter?
I throw out systems every day. I actually sell some systems on killersports.com, which is a pretty popular site. And I sell my subscriptions out there. So I wanted to run a special for the NCAA tournament of $79 for the whole tournament. And I really haven't lost my mind. But if it loses, I'll give you the rest of the NBA season for free. My goal is to hopefully help as many people as I can learn more about using advanced analytics to your advantage in betting, and maybe someday actually doing it on your own, which is I find incredibly fun to do. So I like meeting the people that are the new followers and getting to know what they like, what they don't like, what they want to get out of it, what even stuff that I can provide to help. So that's the goal, and that's the reason for the cheap price as well.
Well, make sure you follow John on Twitter. Once again, that's at John Ryan Sports and the number 1. And check out his stuff on the Big East and the Big Ten over at BangTheBook.com. John, always a pleasure. Thanks for breaking it down for us. We really, really appreciate it. And we'll talk to you again next week in advance of March Madness.
You got it, Adam. Can't wait. Thank you.